The story of the goat and the child, compassion that transformed an entire village. Before the sky could fully brighten, the villagers had already swarmed out like bees from a broken hive. Whispers filled the air, and cold, shadowed gazes clung tightly to a tattered shack at the village's edge. There, a crowd circled a man being beaten until his skin turned purple. That man was Majid, a solitary goat herd, gentle and quiet, who had never harmed a soul. But today, all that vanished under the weight of a vicious rumor. His goat gave birth to a human baby. Majid no longer knew if he was awake or trapped in a nightmare. Blood blurred his vision, but he kept muttering, "No, not me. I only found it. I didn't do anything. My goat, she just..." The hiss of lashes slicing through air. Sandals pounding the ground. Women sobbing until they collapsed. It felt less like a village and more like an execution ground. No one believed Majid. In their eyes, there were no miracles for a poor, lonely man who spent his life in the wilderness with a herd of goats. They saw things through a brutal lens. He must have done something filthy with the goat. And that monstrous baby, it's the proof. But the truth, as always, was never that simple. The night before, when the mist fell thick as a net, Majid had led his goats up to the forest's edge to graze. Beneath an ancient agarwood tree, his dearest goat Chandani suddenly stopped and let out strange cries. Majid feared a snake bite. But as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, in the rotting leaves, lay a newborn infant, blood red, eyes unopened, latched onto Chandani's teat as if she were its real mother. Chandani licked the child over and over. She wasn't afraid. She didn't back away. It was as if some invisible thread had tied the two together. Majid trembled. The child was too beautiful. So beautiful it made him cry. And then, something deep within urged him. He wrapped the child in his cloak and took him home. That was when the misfortune began. Majid named the boy Hassan, a symbol of new hope of life, a divine gift for a barren man like himself. No matter who doubted him, no matter how the villagers scorned him, he kept the child alongside Chandani, raising him with the last bits of his shattered life. But then came the chime of karma's bell. Hassan's appearance wasn't just a miracle. It was the key to a buried horror, an ancient secret lying beneath the damp forest soil. A secret steeped in blood, jealousy, lust, and sin, intertwining people who once thought they had nothing in common. Majid, outcast, scorned, built a hut near the woods, where morning mist crept in and owls howled like curses from lingering ghosts. He lived there with his wife, Zara, and the child he called Hassan, the boy the entire village claimed was born of an unspeakable sin. But Zara believed her husband. Not in words, but in his eyes. In Majid's gaze, there was no lust, only terror, and a blind belief in fate. Chandani, the white goat, never left Hassan's side. She licked his face, slept beside him, and cried out in long, eerie calls whenever he sobbed, like she was calling someone from another world. Zara felt it, something was wrong. Something was hiding in the wind, rustling through the trees. And every night, she had the same dream, a veiled woman running through the forest, carrying something, and vanishing behind a tree carved with a crescent moon. Their closest neighbors were a wealthy merchant's family. His first wife, Zarina, was graceful, quiet, and kind, often visiting Zara with hot soup or gentle words. But each time Zarina saw Hassan, her eyes welled up. Her hands trembled as they touched his hair before she turned away in silent sorrow. One day, Zara couldn't help but ask, "Sister, I see your eyes turn red every time you look at my son. Is there something that pains you?" Zarina was about to answer when Kulsum, the merchant's second wife, appeared, cutting through the sunlight like a shadow. Her voice, sharp as vinegar. "What are you two whispering about? And that child, why does he always make those strange animal sounds? Stop bringing your face into my house like we're friends." Zara left, flustered. Zarina quietly swallowed her tears. But now, Zara's doubts were etched deeper than the worn wood of her doorway. Who was Hassan really? And why did Kulsum seem to hate him so? That night, Zara told Majid everything: the strange glances, Zarina's sorrow, Kulsum's scorn. Majid frowned, his voice low. "Zara, I felt it too. Kulsum is hiding something. We need the truth. Go see Zarina again. This time, don't let anyone stop you." Zara nodded. A flicker of light stirred in her chest, deep in the night's murk of suspicion. The next day, while Majid took the goats far to graze, Zara secretly visited the merchant's home. Kulsum was away. Zarina was wiping down a small shrine in the corner. Seeing Zara, she dropped the cloth, ran over, embraced her, and choked out, "Zara, I had a son. So beautiful. Just like Hassan. But one night, he disappeared." Zara froze. Her old questions exploded inside her. "Tell me, please. I need to know everything." Zarina sat down. Her voice came like an echo from some distant trance. "Long ago, before Kulsum entered this house, I was his only wife. I couldn't have children. My husband was heartbroken. Under family pressure, he married Kulsum. I was devastated, but I accepted it. Then, I conceived a boy. Everyone rejoiced, even Kulsum smiled, but her smile never reached her eyes. I gave birth to a child as radiant as the full moon. And then..." She stopped, clutching her shawl tightly. "One night, I woke up, and he was gone. I searched every nook, every bush, nothing. Since then, I dream of a veiled woman running off with my baby. No one believed me. They said I was mad, suffering postpartum delusions, that my son had died. But my heart didn't believe it. My heart still knows he's alive. Somewhere." Zara gripped her hand. She understood. The storm was close. She remembered the details only a mother would notice: how Hassan wasn't afraid of Zarina. How his eyes softened under her touch. And most of all, the small crescent-shaped birthmark on the back of his neck, just as Majid once described from a dream. She stood, voice trembling. "Sister, you must know your son. He might not be dead. He might be dash." But before she could finish, footsteps echoed. Kulsum had returned. And from the blade-like look in her eyes, Zara knew there was more to this truth. And it was terrifying. Kulsum stood at the threshold. The setting sun cut across her wrinkled face, but couldn't illuminate the darkness in her heart. Her eyes narrowed, each word she overheard piercing her like a needle. Zara shot up, heart pounding. Zarina paled like ash, head bowed as if trying to melt into the floor. "Well, what a pleasant chat. So, more ghost stories today?" Kulsum smirked, a grotesque, forced smile. No one answered. But something cracked in that silence. A piece of guilt's old shell had just split open. Kulsum seemed to sense it. She stepped in, glanced toward the wooden cabinet, the one that once held a baby's red woolen scarf, and growled, "Zarina, don't dig up what the earth has buried. If you want peace in this house." Zarina shot to her feet, her voice breaking like a pot dropped in a full well. Peace? Since my son disappeared, I haven't had a single peaceful night. I used to trust you, but now, I'm not so sure. Kulsum flinched as if slapped. She staggered but quickly regained her stone-cold composure. Watch your mouth. You've been unstable ever since childbirth. You might just be raving. One day, your husband might believe you've gone truly mad. Zara interrupted. This isn't as simple as you think, Kulsum. I've had dreams too, of a veiled woman running into the forest with a baby. And that child. She was about to continue when a sudden gust of wind rose like the forest wailing. Dust whirled up. And from the rooftop, something fluttered down. A red woolen scarf. Old. Stained with dried blood. All three stood frozen. Zara bent down and picked it up. On the edge of the cloth, a faint thread of embroidery remained, half of the name Hassan. Her heart shattered. Kulsum screamed. Give it back. It's mine. It's just an old cloth. Zara's voice was steady but sharp. This is the cloth that wrapped the baby I found next to Chandani. How do you explain that? Zarina trembled. That cloth, it's mine. I knitted it, for my son. I embroidered his name with red thread. Her words sliced through years of secrecy like a sword. Kulsum stood paralyzed. Her eyes darted about, but the arrogance was gone now, replaced by true fear. That night, Zara returned to the forest edge hut and told Majid everything. The flickering firelight cast harsh shadows across the weathered face of the goatherd, but for the first time in her life, Zara saw fury in his eyes. Not for his own dignity but for a woman, Zarina, who had lived like a ghost in her own home. You're saying Kulsum may have taken that child and buried him in the forest? Majid asked, slowly, but each word hit like a hammer. There's no doubt anymore. I'm certain, Zara replied. Then, what should we do? Zara sat in silence. The wind slipped through the door cracks, carrying with it a strange whisper from the deep woods. Then she said, we don't need to do anything, because karma will find the one who planted the seed. All we must do, is keep the truth alive. That night, Chandani the loyal goat paced at the door, letting out long, echoing cries. Beneath the pale moonlight, her eyes burned red as she stared toward the large house where Kulsum still lived, as if waiting for a final reckoning. The sky seemed to shift. Heavy clouds hung low over the village, painting it in ashen gray. No one could explain why, in the past few days, the dogs howled through the night, owls flew low near the earth, and the goats turned unusually aggressive. The elders whispered, the land is stirring. Some spirit hasn't found peace. And then, karma began knocking at the door. Kulsum had stopped sleeping. Ever since Zara found the red cloth, she hadn't known peace. Each time she closed her eyes, the same dream returned, her own hands digging a hole, placing a red newborn into the ground, hastily covering it with soil. Her fingers trembled, but her face remained eerily cold. But now, a new figure entered the dream. A white goat, standing behind her, staring into her soul with blood-red eyes. And each time she tried to turn away, the voice of a child rang in her head, not a cry, but chanting. Holy verses echoing as if from an ancient tomb. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. She jolted awake, soaked in sweat. The room was dark, but she could still hear it, the softest of footsteps, circling her bed. If you're still watching this video and want to help bring the truth into light, please comment the number 9 below to let us know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we recommend you hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a video. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that informs and inspires. The next morning, Kulsum opened her door and froze. Chandani, the white goat, was standing silently in the middle of her courtyard. Eyes locked on hers. No one had led her there. No one had opened the gate. Yet she was there as if she had been waiting a very long time. Kulsum screamed and ordered her servants to chase the goat away. But every person who approached Chandani either collapsed with weak limbs or stumbled backward. The goat didn't move. She only lowered her head like bowing before a sacred rite and then let out a long, chilling cry that echoed across the entire village like a call to lost souls. Zara rushed over, bringing Majid and Hassan. Zarina followed behind. Soon, the whole village gathered. No one had ever seen such a scene, a goat standing in the courtyard, eyes blood red, back arched like a mountain, letting out guttural, growling wails as if about to speak. "What did you do to my child?" Zarina suddenly screamed, tears gushing down her face. Kulsum roared. "I didn't do anything. Are you all insane? It's just a goat. What could it possibly know?" But at that moment, Hassan stepped forward. He was older now, calm and gentle, with a strange light in his eyes. He knelt beside Chandani, placed a hand on her head, and whispered a prayer. "If any sin was once buried in the earth, let it now be revealed. If the truth was ever silenced, let it now speak." And then, the unthinkable happened. Chandani opened her mouth. It was not a bleat, not a growl, but a voice human. Hoarse, yet clear. Deep and resonant, like a temple bell ringing in the night. I saw it all. It was this woman who brought the baby into the woods, dug a hole, and buried him alive. A creature scraped away the dirt with my hooves. I brought him back. And my master, Majid, raised him as his own. The village fell deathly silent. No one moved. Kulsum's face turned ghostly white. "That child is Hassan," Chandani continued. "And his real mother is the woman crying behind you, Zarina." Zarina collapsed to the ground, screaming, then crawled forward and wrapped her arms around Hassan. Majid stood quietly, eyes red, turning to Zara as if to ask, "So, I raised someone else's child? But, is he really someone else's? Isn't this also fate?" Kulsum let out a bitter, broken laugh, the laugh of someone with no escape left. "Yes. I did it. Because my husband loved him more than me. Because he planned to give everything to that boy. And what about my own daughter? Was she to live in his shadow?" A loud smack. Zarina struck Kulsum across the face. But it wasn't hate, it was heartbreak. Because once, she had called Kulsum her sister. Majid stepped forward. Under hundreds of watchful eyes, he said, "You once cast me out of this village, believing I committed a terrible sin. But the truth is, an animal showed more mercy than we ever did. It saved a life, while we cursed it. Today, I ask for no forgiveness. I only hope this village learns to see with the eyes of the heart." No one responded. But tears fell, tears from the same people who once hated, who threw stones, who judged. That evening, after all secrets had been revealed in the village square, the wind stilled. The sparrows still rested on the rooftops as usual. But something had changed forever, not just in the eyes of the villagers, but in the hearts of those entangled in this fate. Hassan, the boy once rejected, once labeled a monster, now stood between three women. one who had buried him in the woods, driven by blind jealousy. One who had knelt night after night, praying in agony for her lost child. And one who raised him with love, though the entire village despised her, though they called her the wife of a pervert. Zara, Zarina, and Kulsum. 3 women. 3 lives bound together by a single fragile soul. Zarina knelt, holding Hassan close, her tears soaking his clothes. My son, my own flesh. I don't dare ask your forgiveness. But let me call you my son once more. Zara stood nearby, clutching the edge of her tunic. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply watched, drinking in every breath, every second. Then Hassan turned, slowly embraced her from behind, and whispered, "Mother, you were the first person I saw when I opened my eyes. I don't care whose blood runs in my veins. I only know, it was your heart that raised me." Those words broke the dam. The villagers who once threw stones at Majid's door, who whispered tales of a goat birthing a boy, now wept like scolded children. They weren't just ashamed, they were devastated by their own ignorance, by the pain their fear had caused an innocent family. And what about Kulsum? She sat slumped, back bent like a brittle branch ready to snap. No one touched her. The rage and jealousy that once made her burn like fire had now turned to ashes. Her face bore fresh scars, bite marks from Chandani, but what chilled people more were the scars in her eyes, the look of someone consumed by her own flames. Majid stepped toward her, voice calm and steady. "If you confess your wrongs to the village, I'll ask them to let you stay. Not because I forgive you, but because, that boy, he's still, in some way, a part of your choice." Kulsum looked up. Her once razor-sharp eyes now brimmed with tears. "I was wrong, so wrong I thought there was no way back. But that creature Chandani, she saved the child I tried to kill. I'm a human, and she's an animal. Yet she had more mercy than I ever did." She stopped, fell silent, then bowed 3 times before Chandani. No one laughed. Because in that moment, the goat was no longer just a goat but a spirit of light, sent by God to prove that compassion could live even in a body with 4 legs. Days later, Majid was buried with honor. Though guilt lingered in the hearts of many villagers, they knelt by his grave, reciting prayers, whispering forgiveness. Zara laid a single white jasmine branch upon the stone and murmured, "You raised a child into a man, while the whole village saw him as a monster. Now you may rest. He's grown." Zarina often visited Zara's house in the evenings after that. She didn't try to claim Hassan, nor reopen old wounds. The 2 mothers knew they could never split a heart, but they could hold up a soul together. And Hassan, the boy once buried alive, was now a Hafiz, a guardian of the Quran, invited to speak and teach in villages far and wide. But he never left his own. He once said, "I was born from darkness. But 3 women, one who loved, one who repented, and one who sacrificed, showed me the light." The story didn't end in punishment. It ended in awakening. Because karma doesn't always come with pain. Sometimes, it arrives in the form of tears of forgiveness, redemption, and enlightenment. 5 years passed. The old village had changed. No more whispers behind backs. No more judgment by stone. People began to listen in silence. To wait before reaching conclusions. Not from fear, but because they had once seen an animal speak the truth, and a human carry kindness born from blood and loss. Hassan was now 17. Tall. Calm. And in his eyes still that strange light. As if kindled by all 3 women who walked with him through storms. Each morning, he read the Quran and the Kitagarbha Sutra. No one had taught him the Buddhist text. Yet he recited it from memory, as if he'd heard it while still beneath the earth. Some said it was a sign of reincarnated karma, that his soul once belonged to a monk who had not completed his path, returned now to continue guiding others. Zara, his foster mother, had grown frail. But whenever she heard him chant scripture, her eyes shimmered with tears, as if witnessing her late husband's final wish fulfilled. Zarina often stood silently at a distance, under the jasmine tree in front of Hassan's house. She never stepped in, but just hearing his voice was enough. Once, Zara saw her clutching the red wool scarf, the very one once buried with the baby, and pressing it to her heart as she prayed. And Kulsum. She wasn't banished from the village, but she lived like a ghost, one that could breathe. The villagers said nothing cruel to her, but they never looked her in the eye either. That silence cut deeper than any curse. Each day, she rose before dawn, drew water from the village well, cleaned the prayer hall, planted flowers by the cemetery. No one told her to. No one asked. But it was her way of atonement. Though no one truly knew, was it repentance, or merely her way of fleeing her own self-loathing. One night, as Hassan sat in his hut reading scripture, he noticed someone outside, sitting under the shadow of the old lychee tree. The moonlight revealed Kulsum's face, frail, wrinkled, but with strangely radiant eyes. "I know, you're the one who has the greatest right to hate me," she said softly. Hassan said nothing. He set down his book, and looked directly at her, not with rage, not with blame, but with a stillness like water flowing over stone. "I once buried you alive," Kulsum whispered, trembling. "Not because of you, but because I couldn't bear the light of others. I hated your real mother, hated my own weakness. And you were just the mirror that showed me my sin." Hassan still didn't speak. He stepped outside, sat beside her, and quietly poured a cup of water. "I don't carry hatred," he finally said. "But that pain, it no longer belongs to just one of us. It's collective karma. A lesson for us all." Kulsum wept. Truly wept for the first time. Not from guilt, not from fear, but because she had been forgiven without ever asking. And that was the most terrifying liberation of all. That night, Zara asked him, "How could you forgive the one who buried you alive?" Hassan smiled, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Because if I don't forgive her, then I would be burying her again." Zara cried. Not from sorrow, but from pride so deep, it surpassed blood. Her son, though not of her flesh, had become a being with the heart of a bodhisattva. From then on, each morning, Kulsum came to listen to Hassan's teachings. Always from a corner, quietly, hands folded like one repenting. The villagers began to see her differently. No one forgave her overnight. But when someone guilty kneels humbly before the earth softens. Flowers began to bloom in front of the village temple. Wildflowers no one had ever planted. One misty autumn morning, the village was wrapped in fog like incense smoke. On the high mound where Majid, the kind goat herd, was buried, a stone lotus bloomed in the dry soil. No one had planted it. No one saw when it appeared. But the villagers knew. It was a sign. For only in places where souls rest in peace can such a flower bloom. Without water, without care. Zara, her hair now silvered with time, knelt by the grave. Husband, our son has grown. He is no longer just mine. He belongs to the world now. She smiled. But her eyes were red. Because she knew. One day, he would have to leave. As every seed must part from its tree to plant roots elsewhere. Hassan arrived shortly after. He wore a simple indigo robe, holding a strand of ebony prayer beads, carved lovingly by Zara herself, from a fallen tree behind their house. He sat beside her, poured tea, and said, "Mother, I've made my decision. I will leave the village." Zara nodded gently. She didn't ask where, didn't ask when he'd return. Because a mother who understands Dharma knows. Some children are born to serve humanity, not to be kept for oneself. Zarina also came upon hearing the news. She said only one thing. "I didn't have the fortune to raise you, but I had the blessing to see you become whole." Then she turned away quietly. No hug, no tears. But in her hands, the red woolen scarf was soaked in grief and love. Here is the continuation of your story, translated into American English with the same depth of emotion, spiritual gravity, and literary tone. Before leaving, Hassan stopped by the old village shrine, where Kulsum was sweeping the courtyard. She looked up, her eyes still sorrowful, but shining with an uncanny clarity. "You're really leaving?" she asked. "Yes," Hassan said. "But not to escape. To transform." Kulsum lowered her gaze. She handed him a small box. Inside was an old talisman woven from hair and grave soil. "I once buried it with you. But when Chandani brought you back, she left this behind. Now, burn it. And burn the shadow I once planted in your fate." Hassan accepted it. Then something no one could have expected, he hugged Kulsum. Gently. But enough to let a woman once seen as the monster feel that she, too, was still human. That evening, under the full moon, the villagers gathered around a lotus pond. Hassan sat in the center, the oil lamp casting light across his face, young, serene, and fragrant like oud wood. He recited a final verse from the Kitagarbha Sutra. "If any being, in past lives, committed misdeeds, they shall reap the karmic fruits in this one. But if they awaken compassion, repent, and save others in pain, their misdeeds become the seeds of wisdom." Then he bowed, one final time. "I was the child once buried in the earth. But through compassion, I was brought back to life. Now I leave not from bitterness, but to plant kindness in places once cloaked in darkness. When you need me, call my name, and I will return in the wind, in the grass, in the chants." On the day Hassan left the village, there were no flags, no music, but everyone stood silently along the dirt path, palms pressed together. No one spoke. No one wept. Only the soft murmur of Namo drifted like wind through bamboo. Years passed. The villagers still told the tale to their children and grandchildren. But it was no longer called the story of the goat and the child. It became the story of compassion between a human and an animal that saved an entire village from blindness within its own heart. The crescent moon rose, alone on a muddy red path. Hassan wore a coarse robe, carried his prayer beads, and a small satchel with a few sacred texts. He didn't know where he was headed. But to him, walking was practice. Each step was a prayer. If you're still watching this video and want to give strength to Hassan's mission, Comment the number 6 below to let us know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed, we encourage you to do so and click the bell icon. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire. The first village, the village of forgotten children. In a distant land called Al Ridwan, Hassan arrived at a crumbling school amidst a field of feathergrass. It wasn't a school for the wealthy, but a refuge for abandoned orphans, left by addicted parents, shunned for disabilities, or simply forgotten. The caretaker was a blind old woman named Amina. She didn't teach from books. She taught with music from the heart. But recently, she confessed, "I fear I'm losing my hearing. And when I can no longer hear, these children will have no stories left." Hassan asked to stay. He didn't preach. He told stories, real ones, but threaded with inner light. He spoke of the Gochandani, of Majid, Zara, and Zarina. He taught the children not to fear darkness, because he had once been buried alive, and still survived, thanks to a loving heart, from someone not even of his blood. For the first time in their lives, the children believed they could be loved, despite their brokenness, despite not knowing a father's name, despite never seeing a mother's face. A girl named Layla, paralyzed from the waist down, once cried and said, "I don't know who my mother is. But from today, I want to call Zara my mother, because she raised someone not her own, and loved him like he was." Amina, though blind, smiled for the first time in years. A smile that lit her whole face. You don't need to see light with your eyes, if that light lives in the voice of a child. The second village, the village of the condemned. Elsewhere, in a region called Jabal al-Gamid, there was once a prison village for those cast out. Thieves, traitors, murderers, and even those who'd spoken cruel words that drove others to suicide. The locals said, "No one there can be redeemed. They're born to rot like trash and die like dust." Still, Hassan went. He didn't say much. Each afternoon, he simply sat in the open courtyard and read the Kitagarbha Sutra in their native tongue, with a voice both tender and searing. One by one, people came, not for doctrine, but for the sound of someone who had once been forgiven. A man named Yasin, who had killed his brother in a land dispute, fell at Hassan's feet sobbing, "I never believed anyone could save me. But when I heard your verse, it felt like my brother was still watching me, without blame." Hassan didn't say, "You are forgiven." He only said, "Sin is like the rain. It muddies the earth. But without rain, seeds of compassion can never sprout." After 49 days, the guards were dismissed. People began growing vegetables, teaching each other to read and write, and renamed the village Al-Maghfirah, the village of forgiveness. And back in Zara, Zarina, Kulsum's world. After Hassan left, Zara no longer lived in the old hut. The villagers had built her a tiled house, but she refused it. "I don't need thick walls. I need the place where that boy first cried." She spent her days carving prayer beads from old forest wood, and sent them to poor students learning the Dharma, each one engraved by hand. Light isn't in the blood, it's in the heart. Zarina opened a school for grieving mothers, not to teach writing, but how to sit in silence and cry without cursing fate. She became a symbol of the mother, who never raised her child, yet was still called mom in the end. Kulsum grew thinner by the day. They said she had an unnamed illness. Eating made her vomit, drinking brought fevers. But when people urged her to see a doctor, she shook her head. I don't want to heal the body when the soul is still unclean. One evening, she asked to be taken to Majid's grave. There she sat and recited every verse Hassan had once taught. And as the sun set behind the hill, witnesses said a white goat passed by, paused, looked at her for a long time, then disappeared into the trees. One July afternoon, the sky darkened. Like a mourning veil draped over the old village. The same village that once buried Hassan in darkness. And where the first light had bloomed. Lightning split the sky. Thunder growled like beasts. The wind surged like a tidal wave. A warning spread faster than thunder. The village is flooding. The northern dam has broken. The lower valley will be swept away. Zara, Zarina, and Kulsum were all in the danger zone. Along with the elderly, the weak, and children too small to escape in time. Hassan, at that moment, was over 100 miles away. Atop a far-off hill, where a new monastery had just been built. They had invited him to become its teacher. But upon hearing the news, he left immediately, bringing nothing but his prayer beads, and the robe gifted by his mentor, made from half-burned oud wood. I will return, he said. That place is old karma, the root of it all. I must return, not to save, but to stand there, if needed, and bear the part of the pain that remains unredeemed. The village beneath water. The flood waters had risen to waist height. Villagers held hands and climbed to the highest hill, the mound where Majid had once been buried. They said, if we must die, then let it be where an innocent man once suffered because of us. Perhaps, the heavens will spare us. Zara refused to leave the old hut. She said, I was reborn here. If it is to be swept away, then let me go with it. Zarina held a neighbor's abandoned child in her arms, as if she were cradling Hassan once more. Kulsum, weakest of them all, was the first to step into the rushing current, guiding others away from the whirlpools. Each step cut her old feet to bleeding ribbons. But she did not stop. I was once a flood of poison. Now, I wish to die as a dam. Hassan returned amid thunder. That night, with thunder cracking like fire from heaven, a figure appeared in the downpour, walking into the village with prayer beads raised high, reciting in a voice that rode the wind. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. No one told them to, but the entire village chanted in unison. The wind softened. The rain kept falling. But strangely, the flood waters curled into a different direction, diverted away from the homes. People whispered, Chandani has returned. Hassan is light. The wind and water obey him. The final miracle. By morning, the skies had cleared. No one was dead. No one was missing. But at the center of Majid's mound, 3 violet lotus flowers had bloomed. No one had planted them, and no one had seen such a species before. They opened toward the same direction, petals soft as velvet. Yet they stood firm as stone. Each one symbolized a woman. Zara, the mother who nurtured with the flesh of compassion. Zarina, the mother who lost a child but never lost hope. Kulsum, once hell incarnate, but who chose to bear karma so others might walk through the gate. The end, or the beginning. Hassan did not stay. He placed 3 small stones at the base of the mound and said, This place was once a grave. Now it is a pillar of liberation for an entire village. 3 mothers each lives in me. I cannot take them with me, because they've already become the light in those who remain. He turned and walked away. No one called after him, because they knew. Some people don't belong to a place. They belong to everyone. 10 years passed. No one knew where Hassan had gone. Some said he headed north, to the snow-covered mountains where forgotten villages lay buried in desert silence. Others claimed he became a teacher in West Africa, instructing orphans in the alphabet of kindness. No one saw his face again. But wherever forgiveness was needed, his chants were heard. Wherever an abandoned child was found, a strand of old wooden beads would appear hanging on a door. Wherever a mother wept alone in the night for a lost child, a dream would visit her. And in it, he sat beneath the moonlight, smiling, reciting sacred verses. In Hassan's village, the people built a small shrine atop Majid's mound. It honored no specific deity. There were no statues, no sacred images. Only a hand-carved stone bearing one line: "Where light needs no name, a bodhisattva walks." Zara passed peacefully in her sleep, her hands still clutching the prayer beads. Zarina devoted her life to teaching other orphaned children. She did it not to reclaim her son, but to carry the love that had once returned to her. Kulsum died after a mild fever, but her smile lingered, like the final flower blooming at the perfect season. The villagers passed down Hassan's story like a sacred legend. And whenever someone asked, who was he? Was he real? The elders would only shake their heads and smile. It doesn't matter who he was. What matters is this: if you ever see someone forgive the one who harmed them, if you ever witness an animal save a life, if you see a child call someone who once hated them mother, then that is Hassan. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and share something you learned today, or how you plan to apply it in your life. Your thoughts are deeply important to us, so don't hesitate to share. Reading your reflections gives us strength and inspiration. If you enjoyed this video and found it meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inform and inspire. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. May all those once buried by sorrow be found by the light, and rise again like lotus flowers from the ashes.